Well, thank you, Erin, for being on our podcast. We're very happy to have you today. Maybe we can begin with you introducing who you are and why you decided to write this incredible book, Free Market Tuberculosis, and why you decided to come to this small little place called Georgia.
Sure, of course. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. This is a great podcast, and I was really happy to not only for the invitation, but also to discover it through your invitation. My name is Erin Koch. I'm a cultural anthropologist. I'm an associate professor at the University of Kentucky in Lexington, Kentucky in the United States. And as a cultural anthropologist, I'm primarily interested in health inequalities, global health changes, global health policy as a cultural arena, science and technology studies, which is a kind of interdisciplinary field that looks at how scientific knowledge is produced and what its impacts and meanings are for people in different contexts. How did I come to write this book? So the book is started out as the research for my doctoral dissertation in anthropology. And I became interested in the South Caucasus region, actually when I was a college student in the early 1990s. So shortly after, the Soviet Union was dismantled, I became interested as an anthropology student in, we would see on the news these stories about, and I grew up in the 1970s, 1980s during the Cold War with, Reagan as our president and all of these things. So, very particular ideas about what the Soviet Union was, very monolithic images of, either this political enemy or potential enemy, but also this kind of place where everything was bland and gray and monolithic and, everyone did everything the same way. And so I was interested in a student, what's it going to be like now for people on the ground in their everyday lives, where this, system that, at least in a theoretical sense, was centralized and provided people with resources and so on and so forth, very different than in a capitalist context. And when I eventually graduated and then went on to my graduate studies, at first I was interested in Armenia, and for a lot of reasons, the research opportunities there at the time were just not possible for me. And so I was like, well, I'm already interested in this region of the world. I hadn't yet made the connection to health, but I started reading about Georgia, and I found work by people like Ronald Gregorsuni, other historians who write, sort of more nuanced analyses. And it seemed like a really interesting place. And by a matter of coincidence, at the same time, I became interested in medical anthropology and studying health inequalities. And so those two things just kind of converged. And after a while, I started reading about the history of Soviet medicine as like a cultural system and a social system, and not just this mechanized infrastructure, but something that was run by people and for people. And at the same time, we started seeing in the news here in the United States and Europe and so on and so forth that tuberculosis around the world was becoming a really serious emergency after decades. And there were a lot of reasons for that. One was decades of public health neglect, right? This idea that by the 60s or 70s, tuberculosis around the world was brought under control. So international health organizations and things like that national governments, right, didn't have to invest so much resources in it as they used to. Another problem was that, tuberculosis is historically a social disease. It's got a biological component, obviously, but it's caused by things like poverty, mistreating people, things like that. And so it's not surprising that, the former Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, Eurasia, right, the tuberculosis problem there really escalated, because when you take away the health infrastructure, economic systems, when you have civil wars, energy crises, like when you have people suddenly plummeted into poverty, and at least in Georgia, and I know this was the case in Russia as well, skyrocketing rates of incarceration, you're going to have a big tuberculosis problem. So I just started reading about all of these things, and as an anthropologist, had a critical view of how the region, and I will say that, you mentioned this already, Silva, but like this small, little known country, Georgia and the South Caucasus were scarcely represented, except maybe in relation to armed conflicts that were going on, maybe in Abkhazia or, of course, Chechnya, things like that. So the representation of this region, at least in the United States, was this kind of, dangerous, war-torn, unstable place, kind of beset by disease and upheaval. And I saw that represented in, maps and statistics and things like that, but I saw very little actual human beings. And so I reached out to some American doctors who I knew were doing consulting work, trying to help Georgia rebuild its healthcare system in a very well-intentioned, very positive way. There were people partnered with Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, for example, who kind of got different aspects of Georgian culture and how important medicine was historically. And by historically, I mean way beyond 1920, way before 1921, right? We're not talking 70 years, we're talking centuries. And during these conversations, people would say, you really need to look at tuberculosis. It's getting really bad in the region. Borders are opening up in ways that they weren't previously open. When people move, microbes move with them. The infrastructure is, weak. It was this kind of rush of global health organizations and this new field of, opportunities to get grants from NGOs and things like that to kind of change the healthcare system, that just kind of blossomed. And I was just interested in what it would look like from the perspective of healthcare professionals to kind of build a new tuberculosis program that was specifically Georgian in some ways, but also deeply influenced by and financially and materially and other ways dependent upon these sort of outside organizations. So that's kind of how I came to the study, just kind of wanting to know what this looked like in a very mundane sense from the ground up, rather than from the top down, rather than assuming that there was something monolithic and predetermined called the transition from Soviet socialism to quote unquote Western capitalism. I wanted to kind of get behind all of that and see what people's lives were like, and in ways that were different from some of what we were seeing in the mass media, some of what you see in economics and some political economy or international relations studies that put numbers and maps and things like that before everything else. I wanted to put the people first. So that's a long answer to your question. And then, of course, I went to Georgia, and that was it. It's cliche, but it's a pretty amazing place. So.
Okay, so you arrived in Georgia. Can you tell us the years that you were here, and then what was your expectation? Did you have an expectation? And what did you find? What was your first impression, sort of, maybe just set the scene when you get here? And also, I just want to say for our listeners, thing that I really loved about your book, and I thought was so much so different than every other book I've read or, about Georgia, is that because you're an anthropologist, you just approach things in a very different way, and you see things that everyone else misses. Everyone's will be discussing policies, this policy, that policy, but you're really seeing what this really means in everyday life, how people are negotiating their old identities and new identities and how they're sort of transitioning themselves. And so like, that's why is my favorite part about your book. So maybe you can like just sort of set the scene and then go into it,
Yeah, no, that's a great set of questions. And, I think you should study anthropology. You definitely are spot on there. So I first went to Georgia in 2000 and I went for 4 weeks. I didn't have any funding. So I went on I was a grad student. I went on my own dime on a credit card. Because I was advised quite wisely by some of my mentors, right, who I was working with, that it's not a good idea to commit to, going someplace for 8 or 10 or 12 months for really intensive anthropological research if you've never been there before. And what if, the connections that you've already started establishing on email or something like that fall through? You don't want to assume all of those things are going to be available to you. So I went for 4 weeks in 2000, and I, found a room to rent in Vake on Atanatis Kucha to rent for a month with a lovely married couple. And I had already gotten permission from people at the National Tuberculosis Program to meet with them. They already said, this is really interesting. Yes, we give you permission to come and talk with us. And so they helped me set up some, initial interviews with people. They kind of showed me around. And I spent also a lot of time just wandering around Tbilisi on my own, trying to see if I could find my way on the subway. My Georgian was not really good then. Sorry, my dog is here. And so it was fun, but it was also kind of terrifying. And I fell in love with the city. Again, this is 2000. It was a very different place, I know, than it is now, which is not to say that I wouldn't still love it. But, I came back. I applied for some long-term research grants. I got a couple of them, enough to support me living there. And I went back in early 2001 and I stayed there for about 11 months. So the bulk of my research was in 2001. And then I went back the following summer for a couple of months. I went back in 2003 in the fall for 4 weeks. I wanted to just kind of keep following up with people because the changes that they were facing, even in just like a clinic or a laboratory, they were changing all the time. And they were changing in part in relation to the roller coaster of healthcare reforms in the country in general. And they were also just kind of changing in relation to access to funding from international organizations that they were dependent upon. So I wanted, I kept going back for like 2 months, 1 month. I went back a couple times in 2007, 2008. When I was there in 2003, I left the day that I landed back home in New York. I got off the airplane and was in a taxi on the way back to my apartment in Brooklyn and heard the news of what had happened in Parliament with Shevardnadze and Saakashvili and the start of the Rose Revolution. I was like, I left a day too early. So yeah, that was kind of, the history of when I had done my field work. It wasn't just like a one-time thing. I went back several times, and that allowed me not only to kind of keep up with changes that were happening in the tuberculosis sector and specifically at the National TB program in Tbilisi, but also just to stay connected with people and to demonstrate. And I think this is one of the things that maybe distinguishes anthropology from other fields of study, to kind of show people that, I wasn't just there to get one story. I wasn't just there to kind of come in and come out, collect some data, write about it, and benefit from it. I was really invested in understanding what was going on in people's lives, not just in their work lives, but in their private lives, in their homes. What did they think of what happened when the Hotel Iberia got transformed into the Blue Radisson? what did they think of all of these other changes that were happening around the city and the country? And I should be clear that, that what I represent in the book is kind of specific to what I experienced in the capital city, which Georgia is a very diverse place in a lot of ways. And so, just as, I don't want to represent capitalism or socialism or the Soviet Union as like this monolithic thing, Georgia itself is not a monolithic place. I think that I expected to be, I don't know what expectations I had, to be honest. I think that I expected it to be challenging, and it was. I think that because I had already lived there for a few weeks, I had some idea of just kind of what the rhythms of daily life in the city were like. And so I already knew how to get to what would become like my workplace. I already knew how to get to, the people whose vegetables I'd like the best at the outdoor market, near at Fogsley's Moedani, right, which is a market that's probably not there anymore. So some of the expectations for trying to kind of like jump in and have my own routine, I had already addressed in that first trip. And then I didn't know what to expect when it came to asking people who were part of very different generations in the medical field. And I mean, by that, I mean people who were trained under very different cultural models of what it means to be a healthcare practitioner in general, and what it means to be a tuberculosis healthcare expert in particular, which, as I discuss in the book, one of the distinguishing cultural features of the Soviet biomedical system was that people were very, very trained in a very specialized way. So it was less a model of general healthcare practitioners and more of, you would have not just pulmonologists, for example, but people who were specifically just tuberculosis doctors. That's actually one of the things that was critiqued by a lot of the Westerners coming in, trying to, help. And my sarcastic tone is intentional here, help sort of transition, right, to the inevitable, better Western model of medicine. So I didn't really know what to expect from talking with people who were trained and worked in different generational eras of medicine, and specifically in the world of tuberculosis. I just knew that I wanted to know what they thought was going on and how they were experiencing it. And so, yeah, I mean, I appreciate that you kind of got what I was trying to accomplish, which was, like I said earlier, not focusing on like a policy or, only on numbers or things like that, but really the very mundane daily aspects of showing up and doing your job, and how important it was for people to continue to feel like they had a place to do that and to share their knowledge and their expertise and take care of people during a period of time when they were no longer getting paid, or being, kind of misled about when their next paycheck would come in. And this is the people I sat next to every day while I was watching them work, right? These weren't like random people, strangers on the street or something, and still kind of showing up. So how important it was for people to continue to feel like they had a role in society and that they had something to contribute, even as they were being told again and again, the way your society was organized before was, sort of wrong, backwards. Again, these kind of monolithic right ideas about the Soviet Union that anthropologists are very allergic to. And then also being told that, there might not be room for you in this capitalistic model. We have to downsize, right? That was a term that I heard all the time. We have to rationalize. We have to focus on good management strategies and efficiency rather than focus on, what that means for a nurse or a doctor who's not getting any salary, and, has to find other ways to feed their family, knowing that someone is just going to see that as a, sort of right with blinders on, right, as a sort of like holdover of quote unquote like Soviet corruption and things like that. So it was this very interesting landscape, right, social landscape, where everybody knew full well that they were being dismissed and disregarded by, in some ways the new government and the healthcare system, in other ways by the international organizations that were coming in to help them. Even people who were, very pro-Rus, very, very pro-Western. And I had a lot of, once I became friends with people, I had some pretty heated debates about what things are really like in the United States, and why we're not the model of democracy. And just, people who knew full well that they were being misunderstood and disregarded on the one hand, but who just kept showing up on the other because, one, they needed something to do. People needed to feel useful when all of these systems of healthcare, education, science, everything just kind of crumbled. And there was just this really interesting tension and a lot of contradictions. And I wanted to kind of understand those a little bit more.
Erin, may I have one question to you. First of all, thank you very much for this interesting introduction and review of your book, because I had just very short time to look through your book. I read your introduction again, and it sounds really very interesting. And as Sofa mentioned already, we are conducting this research about privatization of healthcare system in Georgia and the social impact of privatization. And we plan to have something like follow-up of our research, just to have the survey for medical practitioners, and we try to catch different practitioners from different age and different experience, to have the whole picture. And my question is, that's why if you identified some differences between, because you mentioned that you had the opportunity to meet with different practitioners, like different in their age and different in their experience and different in case of training also, because some of them have been not trained in this Western model of treatment of patients or from tuberculosis, and some of them had just this Soviet way of treatment of tuberculosis knowledge. And that's why, did you identify some differences between these doctors or between these practitioners? Because our approach, and this is a new, I would say, this is not widespread, this kind of research worldwide, but there are some countries which try to catch this picture, how the doctors in the modern time, in modern medicine, identify themselves as a doctors or as a entrepreneurs. And did you find some differences between different practitioners, for example, young or elder practitioners or practitioners with a Western experience or NGO cooperation experience, or without? Do you have some ideas about it?
Sure, yeah, that's a great question. I did, yeah. I mean, I wouldn't want to like over generalize people in different generation categories, but absolutely, especially, when I was there in 2001, summer of 2002, 2003, right, where a lot of the changes in the tuberculosis program involved what was called retraining people, to learn the kind of what was always referred to me as an old model, right? Trying to sort of get them to unlearn the old model. And so I have two answers to your question. One is that one of the first things that I noticed is how other people perceived the differences between people trained in different generational moments. So, I would attend training sessions for tuberculosis doctors and nurses on how to, use the DOTS model and be more standardized in the laboratory and all these things that I write about. And they would talk without even thinking about who was in the room. They would talk about how much resistance there was among doctors trained in the Soviet Union against, trying to move away from this centralized model, this specialized model where people were trained in, very particular ways to be certain kinds of doctors. So, on the one hand, you have these ideas about the different generations and this assumption that there was a lot of resistance. And I wrote about this in the book. You see this in newspaper articles and elsewhere. So this idea that like this quote unquote Soviet mentality, right, which people write about so thoughtlessly and problematically and without even, thinking about how narrow-minded they're being. And then I would talk to people and I would actually, it was very honest. And I would say, back home in the newspapers, this is how people write about you, that you're just resistant to change, that, you're stubborn and don't want, to be Western and all of these things. And, people of the Soviet trained generation that I spoke to for the most part would say, we actually do want to change in some ways. We want more resources. We want to control tuberculosis, right? We understand that maybe to do that more effectively at this time, we need to change some things in terms of, diagnosis and treatment and keeping records of things and so on and so forth. But people were kind of brokenhearted about this idea that a cultural system of medicine, right? Because medical systems are cultural. They're not separate from cultural. They're not objective. They're human. They're social. They're political. They're historical. And Georgia turned out to be an amazing place to find that. People were pretty resentful of the notion that something that they invested in really to care for people, individual people, care for them in a way that this new, quote unquote, new, better model just didn't have any room for. It was all about, you diagnose, you report the results, you make them take medicines, you make sure they take them properly. There was no room for the kind of social relationships that people were used to developing as nurses and as doctors. And so that was experienced, I think, as a loss. And I think the younger generations, right, the people who were, maybe they would describe themselves as being more Western oriented in a way that they saw as being, positive and important for Georgia. Even people who went to Europe, somewhere in Western Europe or in the United States for medical training for a few years, they said, we're not going to participate in the brain drain. We're coming back to Georgia, right? But we're going to come back and be a better kind of doctor who's more efficient, who's been trained to be a manager, that kind of thing. So I didn't really hear so much about like entrepreneurialism, although I think that's certainly part of the picture. When I was doing my research, it was the biggest difference, I think, was just you have to be a good manager. You have to be a good manager of other staff. And it was seen as a, I don't know if I'm capturing this the best way with my words, but I'll trust you to edit it. Seen kind of as a job and less as a profession and being a particular role in society, contributing something to society. This isn't to say that the people I spoke with, you know, in the younger generations and so on and so forth, didn't care about people, right? Didn't want to actually help people avoid getting sick or get better, whether it be tuberculosis or, I mean, my goodness, I don't know what the ovarian, uterine, breast cancer situation there is now, but when I was there, certain times it was horrible, right? So be it anti-smoking campaigns, right? Cancer, tuberculosis, what have you, hypertension, right? Yeah, the main difference was that I think that people were seeing themselves more as like doing a job that somehow seemed like separate from themselves in some ways, and thus as kind of just part of who they were as someone who contributes something to society. Ironically, what a lot of Westerners who were working on healthcare reform, at least when I was there, would say was that, you know, these kind of Soviet-trained professionals, you know, they used to, this is a cliche joke, right? But like they used to just sit around and drink coffee all day. They would lie about the number of patients in their clinics or hospitals to get more resources, you know, at the local or regional or bigger upper levels, right? Even from Moscow. But they weren't really doing any work. And so they just expected things for free from the state, and that what they needed to learn was how to make a contribution to society. Well, the irony, right, the paradox there is that, first of all, they needed to go back to these places, like I said earlier, to feel like they still had something to do. And second of all, that was themselves seeing themselves as contributing to society, right? Like being there in case someone was sick, for example, was crucial. So I think that's less entrepreneurial talk, at least at the time, at least compared to kind of what we see in the US, right? This like, I'm gonna go into medicine and get rich. That's, first of all, not the case. And, you know, second of all, it wasn't really what people were talking about. It was really more like, you have to learn how to be a good manager. You have to, this is very neoliberal, right? Like you have to learn how to be a good manager. You have to, you know, sort of learn how to communicate what you're doing to, you know, international organizations in a different manner, to show that, you know, your old ways of doing things, which were not expert ways, are being changed so that the way that you produce knowledge or care about people counts as what this, you know, global organization or whatever defines counts as expertise. Does that make sense?
Yes, of course, of course. Just no, to strengthen your argument, we have to consider that tuberculosis is not just like some neurologist or some, I don't know, the guy which can practice in the solo way, in the individual way, doctoral practice, because generally tuberculosis treatment take place in some hospital and some organization which could not be conducted in some small office or something like that. Like, for example, I don't know, vertebrologist can do, or that's why I can imagine that we could not call this this identity not entrepreneurial but more managerial, because if we would talk about, I don't know, for example, traumatologists, which has his own office and he works in his own office, maybe in this case he would understand himself more as an entrepreneur, as a manager, because he's in his office as work. He acts as a manager and as a I don't know, co-worker also, and he did not need this big organizational or this organizational big stuff like in case of treatment of tuberculosis, like in big for hospitals or something like that, because tuberculosis you could not treat just in your office, as I understand. That's why tuberculosis has its peculiarities, but exactly because tuberculosis has his peculiarities, that's why can you generalize your findings about tuberculosis and say that, for example, as a healthcare system in Georgia, as a transition of healthcare system in Georgia, in case of transition of healthcare system in Georgia, for example, tuberculosis, your findings in case of tuberculosis could be valid also in different fields of medicine. Can you say some words about it, or can you was it possible to see some similarities, for example, with treatment of tuberculosis and treatment the different diseases in this case? Because tuberculosis more is a case of more public health, which became no, but I will continue a little bit later. I will specify my question a little bit later. First of all, if you can answer my question, if the outcomes of your research and findings of your research about tuberculosis could be generalized on different on different treatment of different diseases?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think to a certain extent, yes. Again, especially, I just want to kind of make sure that, the snapshot that I provided was a very time specific, right? It was 20 years ago when I did my research, or some of my research anyway. But to a certain extent, I do think that some of these findings focus just on changes in tuberculosis control are generalizable beyond, the world of that specific health condition. First of all, I think that the message became pretty clear across the healthcare sector that the training of Soviet doctors into very specialized fields was perhaps one of the causes, right, of why it might have been so difficult to kind of, step in and quickly put in a new healthcare infrastructure. That, whether we're talking about tuberculosis or, oncology or neurology or heart disease, pediatrics, what have you, the message was pretty clear from, funders, especially in Western Europe and the US, who had, resources that came with strings, right, for doing things a certain way, that this over-specialized, what they would call an over-specialized approach to medicine was, one of the root causes of why it was so difficult to have this quote unquote transition. Anthropologists, a lot of us social cultural anthropologists working in the region don't like to repeat this idea that there was the transition. There were transformations, and there was not this kind of unilinear, predetermined trajectory from Soviet to capitalist. Things are much more complicated than that. But so I think, if you sort of dig deeper into different fields, I think the experiences of the tuberculosis doctors and nurses and laboratory technicians who I worked with, yeah, I do think those would be generalizable, despite some of the unique aspects of this, as you said, highly infectious, right, disease that it's airborne. It's not that difficult to catch. We're seeing that now with a whole different entity, right? I think that the experiences of people who were downsized, to use the common terminology, who were ostracized for what was seen as not being forward thinking and open to new ways. I think those experiences are generalizable. I think the stories that tuberculosis doctors, especially trained in the Soviet Union, right, the Soviet model, who experienced that, who went from being extremely important members of society, making clear contributions, even if, kind of the stories that we were told about, corruption and blot and all these things weren't necessarily true, or even if they were, I think that their experiences hold a lot of insight about how policy changes from the top down and without local cultural understanding can actually cause harm, can actually interfere with the very healthcare reforms that are trying to be introduced. So I think one of my biggest findings was that, the sort of what to me at times started really feeling like an irresponsible, forced approach to changing how people address tuberculosis. And yes, there was a serious tuberculosis problem in Georgia. I don't know if that's still the case. Someone needed to come in and provide resources and help. That was no question to us. This is, we have to stop the spread of this disease and cure people who are sick with it, right? But this assumption that I was just discussing, I think is generalizable. This finding that I had, that going in to make these policy changes from the top down with the assumption that no matter where you go in the world, this one approach to treating heart disease, this one approach to treating diabetes, right? This one approach to treating whatever is the best way to do it, tuberculosis, what have you, that can actually interfere with the good work that people are trying to do. And I think that finding in particular is generalizable to other health fields.
If you can describe the spirits of different healthcare, not the systems as technical, system, there's technical approach, but as a more political, more even ethical and moral approach. How you describe this Soviet medical system, and how you would describe this new, for example, I would not say that is a purely free market system, Western healthcare system, but let's say Western healthcare system. What is the difference in the spirits of these two systems?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, I appreciate the nuanced way that you asked that question, right? There isn't just one model of what the Soviet health system looked like, just as there isn't just one version of, a kind of privatized or semi-privatized market-based healthcare system look like. But I like this question about like what's different in the spirit. I would add the worldview, right? I think that one of the primary differences in the worldview is that in a more capitalist society, where medicine is privatized or partially privatized. Even someplace like different Western European countries that have their own models of, right, like socialist medicine, where the state does most of the, provides most of the services without, making it a commodity that you buy and sell on a marketplace, right, on an economic marketplace. I think this assumption, this worldview that individuals are primarily responsible for, first of all, their own health, and that they should be held accountable and responsible for any health issues that they encounter. And second of all, that this is, a fee-based system. And like I just said, I think one of the biggest differences in the spirit and the worldview is this idea that healthcare is a commodity. It's something that you need to pay for. Is it an outcome of people's labor? 100%. Is that labor sometimes, alienated in the way, Marx would have talked about? Absolutely. But this idea that it's something that you can buy and sell and invest in and trade in, and that if you can't pay, then you don't, and you did something, right? Like if you are someone who smokes cigarettes or something, does something that's seen as, high risk behavior, then it's your own fault. Why should the state step in and take care of you? So I think that that's one of the biggest differences, sort of, not just in like you said, not just the technical aspects, right? Not just infrastructure, not just, consistent access to electricity or things like that, not just in clean buildings, but the spirit of what it means to, I would say, not only be a healthcare provider, but also a sick person in society. There's a very different worldview there. And one of the biggest differences is that this is a commodity. And that involves a lot of marginalization of patients. It involves a lot of distancing between doctors and patients, between nurses and patients. A lot of the personal relationships. I think that some of the people I spoke with who had family members who were Soviet trained doctors or nurses, or were themselves trained in that way, didn't like the fact that they were told that in this new system, you can't spend so much time talking to someone about their life. That's not your job. You can't spend so much time trying to focus on treatment regimen for this one person versus this other person, because there might be other aspects of their lives that are affected by their health in different ways. And so I think that ethos, right? You ask this as like an ethical and a moral question. I think that's a huge difference, way beyond the technical. And that's not to say that, every single person trained in Soviet medicine wasn't somehow also entrepreneurial. Some people might have seen this as a way of getting, advancing in a political economic hierarchy, be it socialist or capitalist, right? That's also not to say that every person trained in so-called Western medicine is heartless. But it's that when you get trained in these systems, you're trained into certain ways of seeing the world, of seeing what you're supposed to, how you're supposed to interact with patients and how you're not supposed to. And that those kinds of interactions are used to determine whether or not you're a good doctor or a bad doctor. I think that's one of the biggest differences. So, and it's interesting. It's interesting to think about what's unique about tuberculosis in that way as well, because it's not neurology. People are rarely blamed for having a brain tumor. People are blamed for getting something like tuberculosis, right? You should have known better. You caught it in prison. I'm sorry, but you shouldn't have stolen that loaf of bread, and got stuck in pretrial detention for 2 years in horrible conditions because you wanted to feed your family for, a petty crime, right? So there's a lot of moral judgment that goes on with diseases in very different ways. And tuberculosis is a social disease with a very solid biological component, where people are stigmatized, they're seen as reprehensible, they're seen as disposable. One of the reasons why tuberculosis, I said this earlier, it's a disease of poverty. And so one of the reasons why it became such a problem again is because pharmaceutical industries didn't want to invest in new pharmaceuticals to treat tuberculosis because it doesn't pay off. People who have TB are poor. What's the profit margin there? It's non-existent. So just to kind of go back to one of your earlier questions and explain a little bit why we can see this with tuberculosis in particular too. We can see that kind of distinction, where blaming people for having these, diseases where they're seen as dirty people or not valuable people whose lives are disposable, I think comes into really clear view.
So this idea came after reading of this great book. I think maybe you know about it, from George Ritzer, about McDonaldization generally. And this McDonaldization we can extend already on medicine, on education, on healthcare. And this is quite similar what you told, because it is like you have to McDonaldize all kind of social relations. And that's why it's really good answer, and it's catch exactly this soul of this environment and happenings what is taking place in maybe medicine cabinets. So
also, just to go back to exactly what you were just talking about, example, I think we spoke about this when we've had our first interview, but that in the beginning of the book, because you're getting told all these stories, first about Medea and why we love medicine and why it's part of our culture and so on and so on. And someone's describing the Soviet system and saying how the tuberculosis patients were never let out. Like they were forced to stay in the hospital and they were never cured. And it sounds pretty kind of scary almost. You're like, wow, they were like forced against their will and they were never deemed cured, like some kind of a stigma or a category. And then later you keep reading and then the same story is actually told by, I think, someone else who explains it very differently. And they say that actually in the Soviet Union, you were never considered cured because that means you were no longer the responsibility of the government. And so they don't have that category because you're always they are always responsible for their citizens. And so especially tuberculosis, they sort of track you to make sure, that you don't get, sick again, because it is such a, horrible disease to have, or I don't know, it's disease, right? You call it disease now. I'm not sure that I know that things change all the time with these, how things are said. So having tuberculosis, surviving that, you could potentially get relapse or, have other problems down the line. So they don't ever want to say you're cured as a sign that they are responsible for you, as a positive thing. So something that sounds so negative at first, if you hear it from sort of same sort of, phenomena told by an, anti-Soviet person and a just maybe either objective or a pro-Soviet person, a very different content, So maybe you can talk about how these stories are constantly being told very different ways to you, depending on which doctor or which side they're sort of representing.
Yeah, I know that's a great point. And that sort of, when I started hearing that, anthropologists of course, we want our findings to be generalizable in some ways, but we don't like to overgeneralize people as if they're just one thing and their lives aren't intersected by other things and so on and so forth. But when we start to hear patterns, of course, we pay attention. And once I started realizing that this was a similar narrative that people were bringing up to me without my asking, right? When people start bringing up the same thing to you, that's not prompted by a question you're asking again and again and again. Very different people, right? Like, you know, a nurse in a tuberculosis ward in, you know, one part of Tbilisi versus, you know, a doctor in a really nice new hospital in another, right? Are telling you the same story again and again and again. You have to pay attention. So it's interesting that, and I think I initially had a similar reaction. I was like, wow, you know, it did kind of sound like the sanatorium model was in some ways an act of coercion. But if you think about it, especially before the kind of, you know, more widespread use of antibiotics and so on and so forth, isolating people from their families and communities was really one of the only ways to control the spread of the disease. It makes good public health sense. You know, is there an aspect of like, is there like a carceral piece to it? Maybe. But it was a really important public health measure. And yeah, I agree. This idea that you can never be fully cured, I think has been interpreted by some people as a sign that, you know, that model, that system was somehow a failure because, you know, what kind of medical system are you if you can't cure people from a quote unquote curable disease, right? Something where, you know, if I'm 6 months into this regimen and I'm no longer testing positive and, you know, shedding virus or bacteria or whatever, then, you know, I'm cured. And that's a sign that your healthcare system is working well. But for a lot of the people of the kind of older generation that I talked to, people who still had their jobs at that time, you know, between 2000 and 2004 or 5, I think a lot of the people that I talked with didn't have their jobs anymore. The opposite was the case, right? Like exactly as you said, we wanted to keep track of people. We wanted to be able to keep tabs on them, and that was our responsibility. Sorry, that chat just distracted me, but yeah, it was a positive thing. It wasn't a negative thing, but this is one of those places where, you know, that sort of top-down investment approach, you know, coming from certain organizations really affected the situation because, you know, rather than pausing even for a week to ask people what they thought themselves and actually hearing them, people would come in from the outside and say, oh my gosh, what a waste of resources. It's so expensive, right? So the Soviet system of tuberculosis control was very unique because of this model of active case finding, right? They went out into communities around the entire Soviet Union. It was interesting to kind of, and I would see this in action in trainings, right, for tuberculosis doctors and things like that. So, you know, if you have on the one hand this understanding that of course we're keeping tabs on people so that we can not only stop the spread of this infectious agent, but also you know, make sure that they're being taken care of. And for outsiders who, you know, didn't take the time to kind of step out of their own worldview and their top-down approach, you know, when I was doing my research, at least, that looked like an incredible waste of resources. How inefficient is it to spend so much money keeping people hospitalized for so many years? How inefficient is it, right, to keep them from their jobs and these kinds of things, right? So this kind of economic model dominates everything. And that worldview really shaped how people evaluated and assessed the Soviet approach to TB control, which was based on, first of all, active case finding, right? So we know that this illness is in the communities, but it's up to people themselves to somehow know when it's best to go to get tested or something like that. That's the passive case finding model. So we need to, this active case finding where, Soviet health teams would go out with, fluorography machines and do x-rays of everyone, trying to, look inside their lungs and see if they had any signs of tuberculosis as a preventative measure, has been characterized as highly inefficient. And again, that economic question takes center stage, or took center stage over everything else. And now this kind of gold standard model, this McDonaldized approach to tuberculosis control, which we do need some standards for, like, reporting global health and things like that. I'm not questioning the value of public health or epidemiology writ large, but if you look on the ground, I think a lot was lost with the turn to passive case finding and the kind of market-based assumption that it's the best way to understand the presence of disease in society and how best to address people. So again, it's one of these other examples of how this sort of worldview around, every individual is responsible themselves for making these decisions, knowing these things, taking care of themselves, becomes the dominant worldview, and it's at the expense, I think, of taking care of people. So that difference, I think, between active case finding and passive case finding was one of the most important cultural differences in these models of tuberculosis control. And I think disagreements around that do come into play, even with, things like, are we saying that someone is cured or not? And why is that a social issue? Why is that like an ethical, right, moral responsibility and things like that? I don't know if that really answers your question, Sopo, but.
No, I think it does. It does. I think, like, what is, I guess with the same sort of line of thinking, what other differences sort of did you notice? Because I also realized there's another category, or like you say, you can't say it's just one side or the other, but there were always a lot of people I've also noticed in your book and in real life, like everyday life, not that your book isn't real life, but there are people who know a lot of things in the Soviet model was more correct or maybe more like appropriate, but they also want to survive in this new model. So they will, like, sort of falsely, in a way, just to get the money and the financing and make it, and not be the 2004 downsized, right? Like a lot of your, people, not to be downsized, you sort of have to at least play along with the, the Western donors, right? And I think a lot of people did that. And that's an interesting thing. Like, people know that it isn't actually the good, like it's better in some ways to do it this way. And some, maybe they even practice behind closed doors like that, but their facade must be that everything dots or everything sort of World Bank tells you is great. And maybe like you can discuss those kinds of people, like within this sort of, I don't know, this context.
Yeah. So that's a really interesting question. I think in part because some of what I observed, just for kind of hanging out around people doing their daily work days on end, they often think, gosh, she must be bored, but it's far from the case. But also talking with, I did a lot of interviews with people working with NGOs, working with international health organizations that were trying to help, not just with TB, but with other, conditions and health in the region in general. And I think that what you're describing, right, people who sort of perhaps, hang one sign on their office door, but behind closed doors practice things in slightly different ways. I actually think that that's more typical of the ways in which people navigate illnesses and health around the world than it is atypical. I think it's what we could call, right, like, so I think there's a lot of medical pluralism that happens everywhere. around the world. And I don't think that's necessarily unique to like this Soviet, post-Soviet, I don't like to set up like a rigid dichotomy, but these distinctions. Having said that, the range of things that I encountered were from, I did encounter people who, maybe especially in like less populated regions, when I would sometimes just like take some trips with the tuberculosis program people or something outside of the city, there were people who it was discovered were falsifying the numbers of patients that they had because it knew that it would show that their services were needed. It would show that their polyclinic needed to stay open, right? And so I think that was one of the ways in which people tried to navigate like this very scary situation that they found themselves in, very uncertain situation, kind of at the confluence of two very different ways of approaching healthcare as a, not just as a job, but as a social responsibility and a commitment to their society. Beyond that, I'm not sure. I think falsifying numbers of patients was probably one of the biggest things that I saw. But I also think that, for example, in laboratories, one of the biggest critiques of the Soviet tuberculosis system was that it was completely non-standardized, right? Like people would just make, sorry to be kind of content warning, right? I'm talking about infected mucus as a kind of diagnostic medium, right? But people would just take like sputum samples and take whatever they could use as a laboratory slide when they didn't have like proper laboratory slides or what have you, and just like smear it and do their own staining techniques. And, that was like a pre-modern way of doing medicine, quote unquote. And that this idea was that once you kind of, brought people in from different areas of the country, let's say laboratory technicians, put them through like a 2-day training in your conference room, and they passed a written test, everything would fall into place, right, with this new model. And I think even in the more funded lab that I worked in, which, had a nice generator and, access to resources and things like that, because it was the main laboratory at the time. I think everyday practices, like the mundane work that people would do, wasn't so much as putting up a facade intentionally, but more like the real world doesn't work according to these cookie cutter models. And people themselves, over coffee during a break, over lunch, whatever, I didn't even have to ask these questions at time. They would just say, we know that you're a good person. We know that you're not here to just kind of pop in, get an interview, leave, and like represent us, right? Like they got that I really was invested in them. And they said, sometimes we get nervous when you're sitting with us, because we are like, especially at the beginning, before people knew me well, they were like, is she going to report us to someone if we don't do something the exact correct way? So I don't think in the field where I was working, there was as much as this kind of like facading that I think, people do everywhere. As much as it was, look, you're going to write your dissertation, maybe you'll write a book. We get that. We give you permission to write about our lives. We want you to. Most people don't even know we're a country. But we want you to understand that everyday life in this clinic or in this laboratory doesn't fit into these cookie cutter standards. Sometimes we have to change the order in which we do things that differs from this new manual we just received, right? This manual that's been translated from English into Georgian, perhaps well translated, perhaps not. And we do that because the I'm trying to remember the higher ups, right? Which literally referred to the administrative managers upstairs from the laboratory and the kind of metaphorical sense of higher ups. We have to kind of, sometimes we have to do things in a different order to show the results that we know people are expecting. And there was nothing ever that was putting people's lives in danger. There was no like falsifying tuberculosis tests, right, to kind of get more resources. No putting anyone at harm really, but they just made it clear to me that they were aware that some of what I would be observing and talking with people about on a daily basis maybe didn't look exactly like, someone like the World Health Organization representative would recognize, because daily life, when you're suddenly told that you have to start exactly at 9 a.m. and end exactly at 4 p.m., and that might mean that you don't get to start another round of diagnostic tests because you don't have time to do it. So-and-so might say, I would be happy to stay here until 8 o'clock at night, but I have to punch a time card now. And so I have to leave. Well, maybe I'll punch my time card and try to stay until 6 so I can get the test results for this one patient who can only come at 8 in the morning when she drops her kids off at school and can't come, the rest of the day because of her 2 jobs or something like that. So I didn't see so much facading as I saw people saying, we are aware that what you're observing might not look like what we've all been told it's supposed to look like, but that's our new normal. Our new normal is, carving out different pathways, sometimes on a daily basis, so that we can take care of that one patient that we know isn't available 24/7 to come in, whenever during our working hours or what have you. So does that make sense?
Yeah, of course. So you're kind of saying in this way, it's because I think one of your things you say in the book is that in order for this model to work, a lot of the things learned during Soviet times had to be utilized. So sort of to make the Western model work on paper, at least, also in real life, but to show results, you had to be you had to be sort of Soviet to make the Western model work, like you said, like staying like over time, like over your whatever your work time to do these things, this idea that your role, your response for people's lives. Maybe you can discuss that.
Yeah, absolutely. So like this idea that, I don't know if you know the historian scholar E.P. Thompson, who's written a lot about like capitalist work time and things like that. Has a really great essay about the sort of 8-hour workday and how damaging and unrealistic it is. He says a lot more than that, but this kind of idea that like capitalist clock time for a regular workday somehow maps onto reality, right? Whether that means the conditions of, someone working in a factory or what have you, a patient, a doctor, whatever the case, is not only unrealistic, but, even in the most like capitalist society, but can also be harmful and damaging in many ways. And so, I think that there was this kind of recognition of an appreciation for the importance of sometimes having to tweak things in a way that might look more like, the Soviet approach to tuberculosis control than this DOTS approach. I'm trying to think of like specific examples outside of the laboratory. I think sometimes people would keep multiple kinds of records, right? So you mentioned on paper. So sometimes doctors and nurses would like, and they didn't change the information to like, better their own situation, but like they would keep medical records kind of for their own sake in ways that were familiar to them and that they were being told was, outmoded. And then they would keep the records that they had to keep and report to their supervisor, which would then get reported to their supervisor to the CDC, right? The Georgian CDC to the WHO, whatever. And so they would keep their own kinds of records that included, for example, more personal information that might not be seen as relevant by outside reviewers, or that might be taken as a sign that they weren't operating efficiently as healthcare providers. Because again, this question of, well, you know, times are changing and you can't spend so much time with one person or one patient, right? Or asking them so many questions about their lives. I think people would continue to do that because, first of all, tuberculosis is scary in a lot of ways. People would lose their jobs if someone knew that they had a diagnosis. You know, they could be ostracized by their community, be that in, you know, small apartment complex that had a shared yard, the Georgian word for which I'm blanking on, or, you know, someone living in like Soviet bloc style apartment housing, whatever the case. And so tuberculosis is scary. And I think people just kind of made a lot of decisions, not necessarily like preconceived, but just in the moment of being a healthcare provider that, you know, if we don't establish and maintain trust with these people, they're not going to come back. This sort of clinical in the metaphorical sense, right? This kind of cold, many people found the new approaches to be cold and uncaring. And there were a lot of healthcare practitioners who were very worried that they wouldn't be able to establish or maintain trust with their patients, that people wouldn't come back to get tested again. And you do, right? You want a good, reliable laboratory test. That's not unreasonable. I'm not suggesting that by any stretch of the imagination. And to do that, you do, it's better if you come back several days in a row. Well, if I don't trust my doctor, I'm not going to go back and see them again, even though I know it might be in my own best interest in other ways. And so, yeah, I think people would just kind of try to bring some flexibility and some nuances, right, to even just like their everyday interactions with patients, or you know, I don't even know if this went into the book or not, but I actually did research for a much smaller project about health effects of displacement among IDPs in Western Georgia. This was like years after the TB project. And I would see similar things in that, where, you know, doctors were like, you know, I'm kind of creating more work for myself. So yes, this is less quote unquote efficient, but I keep my own journal. And then I do these forms that I'm supposed to do every day. And the journal helps me keep connected to my patients. I'm not supposed to be doing it. You know, my manager would tell me that I'm wasting their time and that I'm, you know, just trying to, what is it like? I can't even think of the Western phrase, but like eat up the clock, right? So like, you know, I'm just inventing things to do during the workday busy work, right? So I don't really have to do my job. But they would all say, we know that that's what people are going to think, and I don't care. I'm still going to keep these more detailed records about this person and their life so that, you know, if they don't show up to their appointment in 2 days, I can call them on the phone and say, you know, hey, so-and-so, you had an appointment with me at 10 o'clock today. Is everything okay? And they would know that if they said, I'm sorry, you know, my brother-in-law's car broke down and I had to take my child to kindergarten on the bus and it took a long time for me to get back to close to the clinic, I accept that as part of their life and just reschedule, rather than treat them in a way that, you know, they might feel punished or like they've done something wrong just by being a person and having a complicated life. So I think that that's one of the things that that I saw a lot. Again, it wasn't like intentional, you know, deception. It was just, we have to be flexible, if for no other reason than people aren't going to trust us. And if people don't trust us as healthcare providers around a highly stigmatized disease that has really dire consequences for people, we're in big trouble as a society. So
I think it's like kind of incredible that like this idea of how the Soviet Union is being painted as this very cold and uncaring, dark place was actually much warmer. And then the Soviet doctors actually don't like the new model, the Western model, which they find cold and uncaring. So I think it's like so great, that it's like the opposite of what actually it was, like what they say it was, how this portrayed is you're just sort of like in this big hospital, like this. I mean, this is how like these dystopian novels and films and, comments of like, you're alone, no one cares about you in some dirty bed in a hospital or something. But it's like the opposite of people are like, here's journals, here's what he likes with coffee, 2 sugars, and making sure I know the details. So we have a relationship or rapport, and, we wish each other, children's birthdays and whatever. And it's like all these like social things that make people feel comfortable, because it's so horrible. Honestly, I'm one of those people that really needs like more of that proactive like Soviet model, because I will never go to the hospital or doctor. I will never get any screenings if I'm not like forced to, or put or at least somebody that comes to my house. I will never do it because I'm so afraid of doctors and, in general, that I need that kind of thing. Somebody has to sort of bait me in there.
Yeah. And you're a person with a life. You're not, a number on a whatever, a number on a tally of patients or things like that. Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned, the birthdays. And I think another irony is that not only, as you said, that like, the kind of misrepresentations of, I would say, Soviet culture in general, but, definitely the healthcare system, right, is like this kind of like, it's bleak and gray and, it's cold inside because everything's gray concrete and there's no heat, and it's cold metaphorically because, people don't care about other people. And when they do show signs of what could be considered caring, like, I know it's my doctor's birthday and they've been my doctor since I was a baby, and I'm 50 years old. I'm going to bring them a box of candy. Oh no, you're trying to bribe them. That's corruption. That's blot, right? Maybe I'm actually just giving them a present. And vice versa with healthcare providers, right? Like, I think I tell a story of one of the first times. It was in 2000 when I was at the TB center, and they were just kind of like showing me around to the different buildings. And this was like up behind the railway station. So like behind Vogsley Smilodani up the big hill. So, not a wealthy part of town, at least when I was working there. And a lot of the empty hospital buildings were being, IDPs were living there. And there was a lot of concern about that from the Western donors who were trying to build up the TB program. Let me tell you, that's a different story because they didn't like their presence there. But so they were just kind of showing me around the different buildings and stuff one day, and they took me to what was then like the pediatric building for children with tuberculosis. And this doctor, I think, I obviously was not the first Westerner who had been brought in on a little tour to visit things. And, there was this kind of like revolving door. I talked about the importance of like gaining the trust of the people that I worked with, and coming back really was one of the ways I did that, because it also showed them that I wasn't part of this like revolving door of NGOs or humanitarian organizations who just wanted to like put a sticker with their phone number on the wall and say, call us if you need help getting your roof repaired. And, subtext, nothing will ever happen. And so, this pediatrician who was working with TB kids, kids with TB, had clearly encountered a lot of people on this kind of, carousel of Westerners coming in for a quick trip, saying, oh yeah, Georgia needs resources. Okay, whatever, leaving. And that was basically the end of the story. And so he had kind of like a demeanor about him where he was trying to demonstrate to me how desperate their situation was, not because he was trying to like, get something for nothing, which a lot of people might have seen, but he was desperately trying to take care of these kids without any resources. And he just took me around and introduced me to these kids and was just like, this one needs a lung transplant. This one, lost her parents in the war, so on and so forth. And after, an hour or so, it started feeling a little like this guy's going to ask me to give, for me individually, to give him money. And he basically did. And I was like, I'm so sorry. I'm actually pretty poor at home. I'm a graduate student. I can't explain to you how I don't represent an organization, right? Like I'm not with the ICRC or something. But what really struck me was that after showing me around the hospital, he took me into his office, which also had like a crib in there with a sick baby sleeping in it and like a hospital bed where another kid was sleeping. So like they were, they didn't have a lot of space. His wall was covered with drawings that these kids had made him. And he had like, not to reproduce the cliches about Georgian hospitality, but I rarely spoke with anyone without having brandy and candy in my system when I left. So, at the end of the tour, we were just chatting and he brought out some, I can't remember if it was like cognac or some family wine, some wine that someone in his family had made. And he opened this cabinet and he had like 6 boxes of chocolates in there. And I was like, wow, that's a lot of candy. And he's like, yeah, the parents, when they have a little extra, they like to bring me something to show their gratitude. And then he was like, I don't think I put this in the book because I didn't know how to put it in without misrepresenting him, but he was like, it's not blot. And I was like, I didn't say it exactly like this, but in my head, I was like, it's cool, man. Like you clearly care about these people and they care about you. These children love you. Like, I'm happy to have them, I don't see that 6 boxes of candy in your cabinet as a sign that you're somehow being bribed to take care of children displaced by war who are now orphans. I don't think a lot of people would do that work if they weren't sincere about it. So yeah, it's this kind of weird, all of the assumptions. This is one of the reasons I think why I'm really glad you are doing this podcast series, but also like why I think medicine was such an interesting landscape for trying to get behind a lot of the myths around this kind of monolithic Soviet Union and what things are like on the ground. Because I saw so many different versions of like, the thing that's being critiqued by, quote unquote, the West is actually one of the things that people are trying to hold on to because not because it's like this, cold, distanced, harsh reality, but because it's a way to hang on to like remnants of what they thought worked and what is still needed to, again, have trusting relationships with their patients, actually care about human beings as full people, worry less about whether or not their work seems efficient from a capitalist viewpoint or not, and so on and so forth. So yeah, that was one of those patterns where I just thought, this is actually pretty, when you look at life up close and you get behind the numbers and, the maps that just kind of make it flatten reality, right? These like public health maps and things like that, where it's like the Soviet Union is red. And that means that the rates of tuberculosis are really, 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 really high. And that's kind of all you know from those maps. When you sort of step behind the screen and dig a little, or in some cases, a lot deeper, you can learn a lot more about these transformations than you can from statistics.
Because in my opinion, there is when we discuss this issue about social engineering and so on, we have a lot of neoliberal authors, or I don't know, journalists, which call Soviet Union as the biggest social engineering attempt. But in my opinion, it is vice versa. For this kind of capital is what came to Georgia, and generally capitalism is more social engineering attempt as a socialist was, because it's exactly to recreate the people in some really universal face having managers in the hospitals. It is more social engineering way, as for example the way how the Soviet doctors were had the interaction, or were treating their patients, and generally has these social relations with each other, within each other, and with the patients. So that's why, in my opinion, also it is more misunderstanding, or it's both. This is exactly the problem, that no, it is not a problem. It is, in my opinion, is that I used to live in the West, so 8 years long. So I used to live in Germany. I studied in Germany, and even Germany is a little bit different from US, and it's the different type of capitalism, and US is a different type of capitalism. Uh, Even Germans had these prejudices, not because GDR, but generally prejudices that, so some Soviet people are a little bit different. They not think, but they are recreated. They have been created different. They were the same like us, but they have been created different. But I think that it was vice versa. So, in my opinion, the Western society is more created as a Soviet society, because if we talk about we have this discussion every time that in which society people had this freedom of choice and so on. And recently we had this we had this discussion with the former minister of health. I don't know if you met him, Avto Jorbenadze. He wrote his book exactly in this time when you used have been, when you used to be in Georgia for your research. Avto Jorbenadze was a minister for healthcare. And me and Sopo, we had this discussion with him about this healthcare system and wealth reform and so on. And we discussed its primary healthcare, and he told us that in the Soviet Union it was quite rigid, because, for example, people in Wake could not choose polyclinic in Saburtalo, and Saburtalo inhabitants could not choose the polyclinic in Wake, and so on. And he told us that it is something as restriction of freedom of choice. But about what kind of choice we are talking? General, because it is not any kind of restriction of choice, because for choice you have to have this possibility just to choose, and the information that to choose. And if you don't have, it is no restrictions. It is just, if I have the information about one polyclinic where I would be, and each patient would be treated better, as for example, in Wake, they would treat me better as in Saburtalo. Of course, I would go to Saburtalo. At least I try to go to Saburtalo. But if my neighbor had this had this information, don't have this information, it's big inequality between us. That is, and that's why in our West capitalist society, especially, or at least in new capitalist society like Georgia or post-Soviet societies, there is a lack of this understanding of real freedom and real choice of freedom of choice, and so on and so on. It's really, we need just to learn here the basic things, what distinguish, for example, Soviet system from capitalist system, you know. So it was either for remaining Soviet Georgia just for our research and interview, but it was just my opinion about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I remember, I think another, maybe, I mean, right. So another, I think, picture that we would get a lot through like journalism, but also history books and popular culture, right? Like television and film and things like that, is also just that it was a culture of scarcity, right? And that, oh, how sad. And I don't mean to like diminish the importance of, being able to actually choose between, 16 different kinds of toothpaste or whatever. But this idea that, like, oh, like growing up in the Soviet Union, children didn't have anything. They couldn't even buy Levi's jeans. They were closed off, right, from the rest of the world, kind of. And when right, like you can't buy cornflakes and you don't have Hershey candy bars. You don't have, right, like Western music. All of these ideas about like this kind of how scarcity and, hyper control from the state like fixed life in a particular kind of way that I do think was maybe accurate for some people in some ways, but also a misunderstanding in others. And of course, what people do behind closed doors is a different story. But that also got translated into ideas about, right, like Soviet medicine. So, oh, Soviet doctors were closed off from advances in Western medicine because they couldn't travel to international conferences. That's actually not true. People did try, from my understanding, right, is maybe it was elite physicians only, maybe it was elite researchers only, that kind of thing. I don't pretend that there was no hierarchy and, we were told that there was no hierarchy. I don't pretend that there was in fact no hierarchies, but some of these things are misunderstandings, and some of them misunderstandings based on unquestioned assumptions about groups of people and, frankly, ignorance. And some of it's just like not accurate. Soviet doctors did travel to Western Europe for medical conferences and had international relationships and co-authored papers with people in multiple languages. And I mean, just this, again, this idea that this was somehow this like robotic monolith that everyone was just thoughtlessly reproducing is shameful. So, and medicine, again, was just another social arena where all of those ideas were just kind of reproduced and misconstrued and misunderstood. So,
okay, so one of the funny things that, what funny things like that Becca and I had heard while speaking to some of these health ministers and these experts and so on, is I will say constantly contradictory things, sort of like a lot of the doctors you interview. And one of them was like, oh, we had no autonomy. Everything was from Moscow. And you're like, wow, okay, really? And then you're like, later on, they'll tell you they had full autonomy. And the problem was there's no standardization at all. So everyone could do whatever they wanted. They made all the calls in their hospitals, the doctors did. And then they'll say, oh no, we had no control over everything, even though they have countless examples of them having control, and actually more control than under a Western donor, financed model that we have now, or the private one, right? Or both, whatever. We have so many strange things going on. But I find that so interesting about autonomy is that it's the opposite of this idea that Soviet Union, everything was the same and standardized. Actually, the opposite was happening. There was nothing standardized. People had so much autonomy. These other things were maybe decided on like maybe a 5-year plan or something, right? Economic plan. But everything else was sort of very much up to the individuals. Did you get that same thing that they had a lot of autonomy, it seemed like. And like, did you maybe, because we don't know, we weren't there, we don't, you know, like we have no idea, we're just sort of going on what people tell us. But like, did you get a sense that the Soviet model, there was much more autonomy and less standardization than afterwards, like the things that you didn't expect?
I don't know if it would be like a quantitative difference, but maybe like a qualitative one. So I do think that, you know, compared to some of the, you know, like some of the policy representations and other things that I talk a little bit about, I think maybe in the introduction and things like that. Yeah, people did have more leeway for making decisions, especially on a daily basis, right? Sort of on their own without the kinds of surveillance that can come with, let's say, international donor funding, things that have a lot of strings attached, loans from the World Bank and other organizations, right, that might come with strings. And by strings, I mean sort of, you know, agreements that if you don't do things in a particular way and produce the kind of results we expect you to produce, you're going to lose your money or your technical resources. So yeah, I do think that people never really use the word autonomy. I'm not sure what that would be in Georgian, but yeah, people would just sort of talk about, you know, things that they would do on a daily basis, some of which I was already discussing, just to kind of like make sure that things were going as well as possible for the people they were supervising in their clinic or, you know, in their laboratory, or for the patients and the families that they worked with, or their communities that they worked with, right? Be it that polyclinic in Sabertalo or, you know, something else. So I do think that this, I think that there's a lot of counter narratives to this idea of like, you know, there was zero autonomy, zero room for decision making, and so on and so forth. I think there's a lot of ways in which these narratives, right, and these examples that we get from something like anthropology can just poke a lot of holes in those assumptions. And like I said earlier, I think it's important to do that, because if you don't, you know, healthcare reforms that are driven from a top-down model are going to cause more harm than good. And that's a very dangerous situation. And that is not unique to former Soviet republics or anywhere. I think that's very common. Even, you know, in the United States, you know, we don't necessarily have the World Health Organization coming in and making decisions about rural healthcare funding, but we do have, you know, state and national policymakers. We're in the kind of midst of this wave of like rural healthcare facilities are being closed down left and right. You know, it's kind of like contemporary eugenics. You're just deciding whose lives are worth investing in and letting them get sick and die.
So maybe like last comments. Thank you again. I would like to thank Erin for being with us today. I'm really happy. This is like a topic that we haven't addressed yet, healthcare. I think especially the sort of the transition and the ways, and tuberculosis being one of the signs of the tragedy of the swift collapse of Soviet Union, you know, really showing through and being a testing ground, I think, for a lot of things to come. And you having sort of a front row seat to all this is really interesting, you know, for I guess for us, for me definitely, but for anybody who doesn't know anything about that moment, it's really, really important to have, especially an anthropologist, look at it, because you catch, again, so many different things. Is there anything else you think, Erin, you should make sure that we all know? That go read her book, Free Market Tuberculosis, but like maybe you can say like what that means. Why did you call it Free Market Tuberculosis, which is a very catchy title, by the way? You know, it sounds like, first I was like, I'm not sure which way this book is going to go. You know, it's like, she advocating for a free market. So maybe you can just end on that and we'll call it a night.
So I cannot take credit for the title. The title, I was having coffee one afternoon with my friend and one of my mentors, anthropologist Bruce Grant, who's done a lot of work in Siberia and also in Azerbaijan, and is just a brilliant and lovely person. And we were having a conversation about how to turn my dissertation into a book, which is something that people in my field often are confronted with / have the opportunity of doing. And we were just chatting about sort of a little bit of what was unique about my findings and how maybe to expand them a little bit. And he just kind of blurted out the phrase, this free market tuberculosis that you've been studying, so on and so forth. We went on having our conversation, and I was like, I don't know if I know what you mean by that. And he asked me what did I think he meant. And, I remember that this was a very long time ago, but I remember it crystal clear. And I just started talking about the ways in which ideas about, well, first of all, the general landscape of privatizing healthcare in the country, was just foundational to that. And the kind of constantly changing insurance models that I was encountering in the press in Georgia and people worrying about. I mean, standing on the subway in Tbilisi, people would just be talking about it. Like, oh, last week it was this. Next week it's the 5 lorry plan. Next year, what is it going to be? Like the nothing plan, right? And just so how this idea that like it's really up to individuals and not the state to take care of themselves and their health, and how that was very much like a free market model where healthcare is being turned into a commodity. I think I saw that in sort of tuberculosis changes. And so I didn't think of that phrase. My publisher liked it a lot also. But that it did come sort of from the spirit of, I think, some of what we've been talking about today, right? This sort of what happens when, healthcare is really turned into a commodity in profound ways that are very foreign to people because of how distinctive it is from the world that they were living in, and by no wrongdoing of themselves, right? It kind of reminds me of that movie, the documentary Power Trip. Have you seen that? Power Trip? Yeah. Right. So like,
horrible. God, that was horrible.
Yeah, a bill, right? Like, why am I getting a bill for going to the doctor? Like that same kind of like, my world has completely been turned upside down, right? And I'm being blamed for it. So that's kind of where the title of the book came from. I can't take credit for that phrase, but it did come from, what was already there.
That's actually a good way of ending it. Like this entire social world collapse and you're being blamed for it. The entire system falls apart and the individual is like freshly born from the ashes of this and being like, now it's all your responsibility. We gave you no training for this, nothing. And it's up to you to make
right.
it.
Yeah, I mean, right. And
pretty horrible.
Yeah. Thinking about what Becca was saying earlier, right? Talk about a social engineering experiment. I mean, capitalism, let's go back to colonialism and slavery and, land grabbing and stealing North America and building this capitalist country on the backs of people who were bought and sold as commodities. I mean, talk about a social engineering experiment, colonialism and imperialism.